From hostage child to feared prince, Vlad the Impaler's legacy blends fact and fiction. Raised as an Ottoman prisoner, he later ruled Wallachia through calculated terror, impaling thousands who crossed him. His brutal forest of 20,000 stakes outside Târgoviște shocked even Sultan Mehmed II. Despite brief reigns interrupted by betrayal, Vlad created unprecedented order where no thief dared steal. Though killed in battle, his legend grew into something immortal when Bram Stoker borrowed his name for literature's most famous vampire, ensuring Dracula would forever haunt our imagination. They said the stench could be smelled for miles. Travelers crossing the plains near Târgoviște in the summer of 1462 claimed they saw a forest unlike any other. Thousands of wooden stakes rising from the ground, each crowned with the body of a man, woman, or child. Birds circled above the corpses, nesting in the cavities of the dead. Soldiers spoke of infants impaled alongside their mothers, of merchants, peasants, and prisoners of war displayed together in a grotesque tableau of death. At the center of it all was their creator, the Prince of Wallachia, Vlad, known already in whispers as Cepheș, the Impaler. To his enemies, this was barbarism beyond comprehension. To his supporters, it was a grim necessity, a warning to foes both within and beyond his borders. But whether viewed as cruelty or justice, such acts raised an unsettling question. How had a boy born in the small town of Sighișoara grown into a ruler who wielded terror as his most powerful weapon? The answer lies not only in the man himself, but in the violent, uncertain world that produced him. Vlad's story began in the shadow of his father, Vlad II, known as Dracul. His title came from the Order of the Dragon, a chivalric fraternity founded by Sigismund of Luxembourg, King of Hungary, to defend Christian Europe against the rising tide of the Ottoman Turks. Membership in this order was prestigious, marked by the emblem of a coiled dragon encircling a cross. To be called Dracul was to be recognized as a knight of Christendom's frontier. Yet in the shifting tongues of the region, Drac also carried another meaning, the devil. From this double-edged name came that of his son, Draculia, son of the dragon, or son of the devil. Few names in history would prove so fitting. The world young Vlad entered was one of endless turmoil. Wallachia, the principality his family fought to control, was no secure kingdom. Its throne passed not smoothly from father to son, but violently from claimant to claimant, chosen as much by the will of foreign powers as by blood. The Boyars, the high nobles of the land, shifted loyalties as quickly as the Danube shifted its course, serving one prince today and conspiring to betray him tomorrow. At every turn, Wallachia's rulers were forced to navigate between two great predators, the Kingdom of Hungary to the west and the Ottoman Empire to the south. Neither allowed Wallachia to act with independence for long. Vlad's father ascended to the Wallachian throne in 1436, after years of maneuvering in Transylvania. For a few years, the family's fortunes seemed secure, but his rule was always precarious, for he owed his position to Hungarian backing, while at the same time he could not afford to anger the Ottomans. Survival demanded compromise, tribute, and at times submission. His son would one day learn those lessons, but he would also come to reject them violently. The exact date of Vlad's birth is still disputed, though most historians place it between 1428 and 1431. He was most likely born in Sighișoara, a Transylvanian town with strong Saxon merchant influence, where his father resided before taking the throne of Wallachia. The house where Vlad Dracul lived still stands, a 3-storied building overlooking the town square. Here, amid the bustle of foreign traders and the looming presence of the Carpathian hills, The boy who would one day terrify Europe first opened his eyes. His mother remains more shadowed in history. Some accounts suggest she was a Moldavian princess, linking Vlad to the princely line of Alexander the Good of Moldavia. If so, it was yet another dynastic tie binding the child into the complex web of alliances and rivalries that defined the region. Family mattered deeply, but it was never simple. Vlad would grow up with two brothers whose fates diverged sharply. Murcha, the eldest, who would inherit his father's hopes but not his throne, and Radu, the youngest, whose beauty and charm would later make him a favorite at the Ottoman court. The bonds between the three brothers would be tested in blood, betrayal, and war. If Vlad's childhood was marked by privilege, it was also overshadowed by danger. His grandfather, Murcha I, had been one of the most celebrated rulers of Wallachia, a man who fought the Ottomans to a standstill and left behind a legacy of strength and defiance. But such glory carried a curse. Each of his descendants believed himself entitled to the throne, and each was willing to kill for it. Vlad grew up knowing that princely blood was as much a target as it was a claim. Even the symbols surrounding him were double-edged. The dragon of his father's order was meant to inspire fear in enemies and loyalty in allies. But among Wallachia's peasants, whispers grew of darker meanings. Dracul might be the dragon, but in the murmurs of the marketplace he was also the devil, and his sons the devil's spawn. Vlad, as Draculea, inherited not only a claim to the throne, but also a reputation, half respect and half dread. As he grew, Vlad would witness firsthand the precariousness of rule. His father's efforts to balance between Hungary and the Ottomans would repeatedly bring the family into peril. By the time Vlad was barely more than a boy, this dangerous diplomacy would see him and his younger brother, Radu, sent away as hostages to the Ottoman court, pawns in a larger game of empire. It was there, in the shadow of the sultans, that his character would be tempered, his hatred sharpened, and his methods defined. But long before that exile, the stage was already being set. Vlad's world was one of treachery, of boyars who would betray their prince for a handful of gold, of kings and sultans who treated Wallachia as a buffer zone rather than a sovereign state, and of constant threats from without and within. In such a place, mercy was weakness, and hesitation could mean death. The boy who would one day order forests of impaled bodies did not emerge in isolation. He was the product of a frontier drenched in blood, a family name that carried both honor and menace, and a childhood steeped in betrayal. The dragon and the devil were both in his heritage, and before long he would learn to wear those titles as weapons. And so, while the world would one day recoil at his cruelty, perhaps the deeper truth is that Wallachia itself was already cruel, already brutal, and already merciless. Vlad did not invent the violence of his age. He inherited it, absorbed it, and finally wielded it with a ferocity that would etch his name into history. The child born in Sigashora would soon be carried into the heart of the Ottoman Empire, a hostage prince taught the art of war by his enemies. There, behind stone walls and under the watch of his captors, the seeds of the impaler were sown. The boy who would one day terrify Europe was barely 10 years old when his fate was torn from him. In the spring of 1442, the ruler of Wallachia, Vlad II, known as Dracul, the Dragon, for his membership in the Order of the Dragon, faced an impossible choice. Pressed by the Sultan of the Ottoman Empire to prove his loyalty, he was ordered to bring 2 of his sons across the Danube into enemy territory. For Dracul, the decision was agony. Refusal meant invasion and certain destruction. Compliance meant giving up the heirs to his house as bargaining chips. In the end, calculation outweighed sentiment. the prince delivered his children into foreign hands. Thus began the captivity of young Vlad and his brother Radu. The brothers were transported to Edirne, the Ottoman capital at the time, where the court of Sultan Murad II ruled with a mixture of ceremony and iron discipline. The citadel was a place of magnificence: tiled palaces, domes glittering in the sun, markets overflowing with goods from 3 continents. Yet for the 2 boys from the Carpathians, it was also a prison. They were hostages, held not out of affection, but to guarantee their father's compliance. Life in the Sultan's custody was complex. The children were treated according to their station, provided with tutors, fine clothes, and military instruction. They were taught languages, Turkish, Greek, and Arabic, alongside the Latin they already knew. They studied strategy and the arts of war. At times they even enjoyed companionship with other noble youths brought as pledges of loyalty. Yet the gilded cage had sharp bars. The knowledge hung constantly over their heads that if the elder Dracul wavered in his tribute or allegiance, their lives could be forfeit. This knowledge weighed differently on each brother. Radu, fair-faced and charismatic, adapted with surprising ease. His charm won him the attention of courtiers and eventually of the Sultan himself. Sources later describe him as the handsome, a youth who embraced the culture of the empire, rode with its soldiers, and became a favorite of its rulers. His elder sibling, however, responded with bitterness. Suspicious by nature, the boy from Sigishwara interpreted every kindness as manipulation, every lesson as an attempt to weaken his will. In later years, stories circulated that he endured beatings, humiliation, and threats of execution. Whether true or exaggerated, there is no doubt that his time in Ottoman hands hardened him into someone who trusted few and forgave none. Even so, captivity provided more than resentment. The dragon's son observed his captors closely. He learned their methods of rule, their use of terror, and their reliance on absolute obedience. He listened to stories of impalement, an execution method practiced by Turks long before he made it infamous, and watched how fear kept multitudes in line. He saw how armies could be raised swiftly from the provinces, how administrators collected taxes, and how loyalty was rewarded while betrayal was punished without hesitation. The young hostage absorbed these lessons, later applying them in ways that astonished even his teachers. Meanwhile, his father's fortunes shifted unpredictably. In 1444, when the Crusade of Varna brought a Hungarian-led army against the Sultan, the dragons sided with the Christians. The battle ended in disaster. The Hungarian king was killed, an Ottoman victory assured. For a time, the brothers' lives hung in the balance. Their father had broken faith with the empire, and punishment was expected. Vlad II feared his sons would be executed as reprisal. Yet Murad spared them, reasoning that living hostages were more useful than dead children. The effect on the elder boy was profound. To be kept alive, not out of compassion, but out of political convenience, left its mark. Years later, when he himself ruled Wallachia, he would treat lives with the same cold calculus. Mercy was irrelevant. Utility was all that mattered. During these years, Radu drew closer to his captors, while the future impaler withdrew into himself. His contempt for the court grew alongside his fascination with its power. One can imagine him wandering the courtyards of Edirne, watching the ceremonies of the Janissaries, listening to the clatter of hooves as cavalry trained on the parade grounds, feeling at once trapped and educated. Every day sharpened his hatred of submission. Every day taught him how dominance could be maintained. While the 2 brothers lived under watchful eyes, events in Wallachia moved at their own violent pace. Their father continued his dangerous balancing act, sometimes swearing loyalty to the Sultan, at other times conspiring with Hungary. The Boyars, ever opportunistic, plotted and betrayed with little regard for stability. When Vlad II finally chose once again to back the Hungarians, he signed his own death warrant. By 1447, Hungarian forces under John Hunyadi swept into Wallachia. The dragon was captured and executed, his eldest son, Mircea, buried alive by rival nobles. The Târgoviște dynasty appeared broken. News of these deaths must have reached the hostages in Edirne. For the elder boy, already filled with resentment, the murder of his father and brother by treachery confirmed his conviction that power alone mattered, and that betrayal would always lurk in the shadows. To survive in such a world required brutality greater than one's enemies could imagine. The seeds of his later reign, his merciless purges of nobles, his reliance on terror, were sown in the knowledge that his own kin had perished, because loyalty could not be trusted. Radu, by contrast, found his prospects improved. With their father dead, he had no reason to long for Wallachia's throne. The younger sibling embraced his life at court, deepening his ties to the Ottomans, and eventually becoming their chosen candidate for the Wallachian crown. The schism between the brothers was complete. One hardened in hatred, the other seduced by acceptance. When historians look back on Vlad's captivity, they often describe it as a crucible. It was here that the Wallachian heir was molded into something far more dangerous than a simple noble claimant. Stripped of family security, surrounded by enemies, and educated in the language of fear, he became a man who would one day reflect the methods of the empire back upon it, only darker, sharper, and more personal. His cruelty was not an invention out of nothing, but a distortion of the lessons he had learned in childhood. Obedience enforced through terror, loyalty demanded through fear. Years later, when he would drive wooden stakes into the earth and leave thousands of corpses as warnings, he was not merely being sadistic, he was recalling the power he had once seen wielded by others, reshaping it into his own brand of rule. In captivity, he learned that survival depended on inspiring dread. In Wallachia, he would put that principle into practice with a ferocity that stunned the world. For now, though, he remained a boy under guard, waiting for the moment when fortune would return him to his homeland. That moment would not come gently. When he at last stepped back onto Wallachian soil, it would be as a claimant thrust into a deadly struggle for power. His father and brother were gone, his land controlled by others, and his only tools the lessons of fear and cunning learned in the halls of Edirne. The Impaler was not yet born, but the foundations of his character were firmly laid. Soon, exile would end, and his first attempt at rule would begin. When word reached Edirne that the elder Dracul had been cut down and his eldest son, Mircea, buried alive, the two hostages knew their family's fate had collapsed. For the dragon's son, it was confirmation of everything he had come to suspect. Alliances were worthless, oaths meaningless, and only ruthlessness could guarantee survival. His father's careful balancing between Hungary and the Turks had ended not in triumph, but in betrayal and death. His brother's dignity had not spared him the cruelty of suffocation beneath earth. Power in Wallachia had passed to another, installed by foreign will. John Hunyadi, the great Hungarian commander, moved swiftly to fill the void. With the elder Dracul gone, he placed Vladislav II, a cousin of the family, on the Wallachian throne. This new ruler owed his position entirely to Hungarian steel and would serve their interests. To the boy in captivity, The sight of his cousin wearing the crown that should have been his was another scar laid over wounds already festering. The Ottomans, however, saw an opportunity. In the autumn of 1448, Hunyadi led a massive army southward to confront the Sultan at Kosovo. The regent's absence from Transylvania left his protégé exposed. With Ottoman's support, the dispossessed heir crossed the Danube and marched into Wallachia. For the first time, Vlad Dracula claimed his father's seat. The attempt was brief and precarious. His power was tenuous, supported not by boyar loyalty, but by foreign arms. Chronicles suggest his reign lasted no more than 2 months. By December, the Hungarian commander returned from his campaign, battered but alive, and Vladislav II reclaimed his position. The claimant fled back to the empire that had sponsored him. Thus ended the first of 3 reigns. A taste of power too fleeting to satisfy, yet enough to ignite an obsession. The young pretender wandered. For a time he lingered within Ottoman lands, watching the court of Murad from a position no longer of honoured hostage, but of uncertain client. Yet he soon sought other allies. By 1449 or 1450, he moved north into Moldavia, where Bogdan II, an uncle by marriage, held sway. It was here that Vlad first formed bonds with Bogdan's son, Stephen, who would later be remembered as Stephen the Great. The 2 youths, both exiles in their own way, must have found in each other an understanding of ambition and loss. But safety never lasted long. Moldavian politics proved as treacherous as Wallachia's. Bogdan was cut down in 1451, leaving Stephen and Vlad to flee. They found temporary refuge once more in Transylvania, appealing to the same Hungarian lords who had once been enemies. The boy from Sighișoara, now a restless wanderer, shifted constantly between potential patrons, searching for the right moment to seize his inheritance. In these years of exile, his character sharpened. Every court he visited reminded him that loyalty was fluid, promises conditional, and survival dependent on strength. In Moldavia, he saw how a prince could be murdered by his own rivals. In Hungary, he observed how the Hunyadis used propaganda as well as steel to maintain power. From the Ottomans, he had already learned how terror could discipline populations. The dispossessed prince carried these lessons like weapons, storing them for the day he might return. Radu, meanwhile, had taken a different path entirely. Remaining in the Ottoman court, the younger sibling grew ever closer to their captors. He adopted their dress, their language, and their faith. He became known as the Handsome, favoured by the Sultan not only for his beauty but for his loyalty. When the empire looked for pliant candidates to rule Wallachia, it would be Radu, not his elder brother, who seemed the natural choice. The contrast between them widened into a chasm, one groomed by Turks to serve as their client, the other burning with resentment and a desire for vengeance. For the Wallachian heir, exile was both humiliation and education. Though he lacked an army, he cultivated patience. He wrote letters to the Saxon towns of Transylvania, offering protection or threats depending on his prospects. He studied the geography of the Carpathians and the fortresses that guarded their passes. He watched how quickly alliances shifted between Moldavia, Hungary, and Poland, and began to imagine how he might one day turn their rivalries to his advantage. The year 1453 brought news that shook all of Christendom. Constantinople had fallen to the Sultan's armies. The empire that had once been Rome's eastern heir was gone, and the Turks now stood astride Europe's gates. For the wandering claimant, the fall of the city was a lesson written in fire. If the most fortified capital in the world could be breached, then small principalities like Wallachia survived only at the mercy of giants. To stand against them would demand not merely courage, but a ruthlessness equal to their own. By the mid-1450s, Hungary itself was in turmoil. John Hunyadi, the commander who had slain his father, was dead. His sons vied for influence, and the kingdom's throne grew unstable. In this shifting landscape, opportunity flickered once again. With Hungarian support, the exiled heir prepared to march back into his homeland. The cousin who had replaced him, Vladislav II, now faced not only the resentment of Boyars, but also the return of a rival hardened by years of captivity and exile. Looking back, these wandering years may seem like a pause in the story, a gap between captivity and true power. Yet for Vlad Dracula, they were essential. In exile, he lost his father, his brother, and his homeland. He endured betrayal after betrayal. He drifted between courts, never secure, always dependent on the whims of stronger powers. And yet, in this crucible, he forged the qualities that would later define him: suspicion sharpened into paranoia, humiliation hardened into vengeance, and the lessons of power distilled into a single truth: fear would be his only ally. When he returned to Wallachia in 1456, it would no longer be as the uncertain boy of 1448. The young exile had grown into a man who understood that survival required not compromise, as his father had believed, but terror. The world would soon discover just how far he was willing to carry that principle. In the summer of 1456, after years of wandering exile, the dragon's son returned to claim what he believed was rightfully his. With Hungarian support and the death of John Hunyadi, the political balance shifted. The rival who had sat on his throne, Vladislav II, marched to meet him. On the battlefield, the two kinsmen clashed, and the cousin who had replaced him fell. The dispossessed heir was now prince, in fact, not merely in name. From the moment he secured Wallachia's seat, the new ruler made clear that his reign would not resemble those that had preceded it. His very first surviving letter, addressed to the burghers of Brasov in September of that year, dripped with confidence. He promised protection to Transylvanian merchants in case of Ottoman attack, yet beneath the polite assurances was the unmistakable tone of command. No longer the restless wanderer writing in hope, he now spoke as Lord of Wallachia. But words alone could not secure his rule. The throne on which he sat was cursed by betrayal. His father had been cut down through treachery. His brother Mircea had been murdered by nobles who switched allegiance at the first sign of danger. For the impaler-to-be, the Boyars were not partners in governance, but threats waiting to strike. The only way to prevent history from repeating itself, he decided, was to destroy those who had betrayed his bloodline. The chronicles speak of gatherings in the princely court at Târgoviște. Nobles summoned under the pretense of consultation arrived in their finest garments, perhaps believing the young ruler would seek their advice. Instead, they were seized. Some were executed immediately, thrust upon wooden stakes that lined the roads as a warning to any who doubted his resolve. Others were marched into forced labor, compelled to build fortifications in the mountains. The infamous castle of Poenari, perched high above the Argeș River, was said to have been rebuilt by these captives, their chains clinking as they carried stones up the steep slopes. Few survived the task. This purge was not random slaughter. It was, in the prince's eyes, a necessary reshaping of the state. By eliminating those families that had conspired against his father and brother, he created space to elevate new men, loyal retainers who owed their status entirely to him. In this way, the Wallachian nobility was remade, transformed from an independent aristocracy into a class bound to their ruler by gratitude and fear. From this moment, Vlad began to be spoken of not just as prince, but as voivode, the title reserved for Wallachhia's supreme leader, a word that meant both warlord and sovereign. It was a name that captured his authority as much as his cruelty, and it would follow him for the rest of his life. Contemporary accounts vary in their numbers, but all agree that the killings were extensive. Some speak of hundreds executed, others of thousands. The exact figures matter less than the impression. Within a short span, the countryside understood that a new kind of ruler had taken power. Where previous princes had bargained with magnates, this one demanded obedience under pain of death. The manner of execution left no doubt about his intent. Impalement was not simply killing, it was spectacle. A sharpened stake, driven through the body and planted upright, left the victim writhing for hours or even days. Displayed along roadsides or outside fortresses, the sight served as both punishment and warning. By choosing this method, the voivode ensured that every passerby absorbed the lesson. Betrayal would not only be punished, it would be made unforgettable. Tales of these punishments began to spread. In Saxon towns across the mountains, merchants whispered of nobles skewered like animals. In Moldavia, rumors reached Stephen, his one-time companion, that the Wallachian heir had transformed into something merciless. Even in Hungary, observers noted the ferocity with which he ruled. Some condemned it as savagery. Others, more pragmatic, saw in it the harsh discipline necessary to control a land long riven by faction. Yet to the ruler himself, cruelty was not a matter of reputation, but of policy. He had seen his father fall because of hesitation, his brother suffocate because Boyars shifted loyalty. Never again would he permit such weakness. Fear, he concluded, was more reliable than friendship. If obedience could not be secured through respect, it would be compelled through terror. As the months passed, the executions continued. Chronicles from Leonikos Chalkokondyles, a Byzantine historian, recorded that hundreds or thousands perished at the young ruler's command. Property and titles were redistributed to loyal men, reshaping Wallachhia's council until scarcely any of the old aristocracy remained. By 1460, only a handful of names from previous decades still held office. The rest had been replaced by figures tied directly to the throne. The atmosphere of the court changed. Where once Boyars had debated policy and vied for influence, now silence reigned. Every noble who survived knew that the prince's gaze was upon him, measuring loyalty with suspicion. Even small signs of disobedience could end with a body on a stake. Visitors described the climate as one of awe mixed with dread. The ruler had become the axis around which all authority turned, and his word was law in a way unseen before in Wallachia. Still, such terror carried consequences. Merchants in Transylvania began to fear for their own safety when disputes arose. Stories circulated that travelers who cheated customers were punished with gruesome ingenuity. In one tale, a merchant who sold rotten meat was forced to eat it himself until he died. In another, a thief was executed alongside his entire family, a reminder that crime would stain not only the guilty, but their kin. Whether these stories were exaggerated or not, they revealed how quickly the ruler's reputation was spreading. Even so, within Wallachia itself, order began to take hold. Roads that had long been plagued by brigands grew safer. Taxes were collected more efficiently. The peasants, accustomed to being preyed upon by shifting noble factions, now looked to a single figure whose wrath was terrible, but whose authority was clear. In the paradox of the age, cruelty brought stability. By the close of the 1450s, the young voivode had remade his realm. He was no longer the uncertain claimant of 1448, but a ruler whose authority rested on a foundation of blood. Yet beyond Walachia's borders, enemies stirred. The Saxon merchants of Transylvania resented his heavy-handed policies. The Ottoman Empire, watching from the south, remembered the child hostage they had once held and prepared to test his loyalty. The Purges had secured his throne, but they had also marked him indelibly. To his people, he was both protector and tyrant. To his neighbors, both ally and menace. The name Draculia was no longer just a reminder of his father's title. It was becoming synonymous with terror itself. And soon, as his conflicts with the Saxons and the Sultan deepened, that terror would reach far beyond Walachia's borders. The blood of the Boyars had scarcely dried when the young voivode turned his attention to the greater business of ruling. He had purged his enemies, but if Wallachia was to survive, it needed more than terror. It needed order, strong defenses, and a ruler who could command not only obedience, but also fear from abroad. For Vlad, cruelty was never an end in itself. It was a tool, one that he wielded with deliberate purpose as he set about reshaping his principality. One of his first priorities was fortification. The Carpathian passes were gateways through which both friend and foe could enter, and he ensured they were heavily guarded. Castles were repaired or rebuilt, roads secured, and garrisons strengthened. The infamous fortress of Poenari rose above the Argesh Valley, said to have been rebuilt by the labor of captured nobles and their families. Perched on a cliff, it symbolized both his cruelty and his strategic mind, impregnable to attack, and a constant reminder that even mountains could be bent to his will. Inside his realm, he enforced discipline with ruthless consistency. Thieves were executed without hesitation. Corrupt officials skewered alongside criminals. One tale tells of a golden cup placed at a public fountain in Târgoviște. The cup remained untouched for years. So great was the fear of the prince's punishments. Another story recalls how a woman who complained her husband's shirt was too short was herself condemned, for in his eyes, grumbling against order was a crime. Whether embellished or not, such anecdotes reveal the atmosphere he cultivated. Terror so pervasive that it ensured obedience in even the smallest details. Yet while terror secured his lands, it also set him on a collision course with neighbors. The Transylvanian Saxons, wealthy German settlers in towns such as Brașov and Sibiu, had long been a thorn in Walachia's side. Merchants from these towns controlled much of the trade across the mountains, and many had supported rival claimants to his throne. To Vlad, their interference was intolerable. The dispute began with trade quarrels, merchants accused of cheating Wallachian buyers or confiscating goods unfairly. But the voivode's response went far beyond negotiation. Saxon caravans were seized, their merchants dragged south of the Carpathians and executed in gruesome fashion. Accounts tell of dozens impaled outside towns as a message to the rest. Villages that harbored exiled nobles or rival pretenders were put to the torch, their inhabitants slaughtered or carried away in chains. To the German burghers, it was barbarism. To Vlad, it was justice, punishment for siding with those who had betrayed his family. These clashes soon became the fuel for stories that would echo far beyond Transylvania. Pamphlets circulated in German-speaking lands depicting him as a sadist beyond imagination. Woodcuts printed in the decades to come would show him dining calmly at a table surrounded by the impaled, turning terror into spectacle for European readers. Even so, the Saxons were not merely victims. They struck back economically, imposing boycotts, supporting rival claimants, and spreading propaganda to blacken his name. Their tales of his cruelty, some based in truth, others exaggerated beyond measure, helped establish the reputation of the Impaler long before his death. But reputation alone did not trouble him. If anything, he embraced it. Within Wallachia, the brutality brought an undeniable order. Roads once plagued by brigands became safe. Peasants, long exploited by quarreling nobles, now served under a ruler whose punishments were impartial and absolute. A thief might die alongside a corrupt nobleman, but the fields would be ploughed and the harvest collected. Fear was the price of stability, and many ordinary people, though terrified, lived under greater security than before. At the same time, his methods began to attract attention from foreign courts. Letters carried news of the Wallachian ruler who skewered enemies by the hundred, who reduced proud nobles to servants, who broke Saxon defiance with fire and blood. Some in Hungary saw him as a strong buffer against Ottoman expansion. Others worried he was a tyrant whose savagery would destabilize the region. To the empire to the south, however, his behavior was becoming intolerable. The Sultan expected tribute from Wallachia, a sign of vassalage paid in coin and loyalty. Previous princes, including Vlad's father, had submitted reluctantly, seeing it as the cost of survival. But this new voivode, hardened by captivity and exile, viewed submission as betrayal. When Ottoman envoys arrived demanding payment, he offered them not gold, but death. According to later accounts, the messengers refused to remove their turbans in his presence, claiming it was their custom to wear them before rulers. Vlad replied that he would strengthen their custom, and ordered the turbans nailed to their skulls with iron spikes. Few stories capture more vividly the mixture of cruelty and dark humor that characterized his rule. Such acts left no doubt. The Wallachian prince would not be an obedient vassal. He had established order at home through terror, subdued rivals with blood, and punished foreign merchants with fire. His star was rising and his enemies multiplying. The Saxons cursed him in pamphlets. The Sultan prepared to strike, but in his own mind, he was finally becoming the ruler destiny had promised. The dragon's son had turned his land into a realm of fear. Now he was ready to turn his wrath outward, against the empire that had once held him hostage, and against a sultan whose power reached across continents. By the early 1460s, the ruler of Wallachia had secured his throne at home, but his defiance now pointed him toward a far more dangerous enemy. To the south, across the Danube, stretched the dominion of Mehmed II, the conqueror of Constantinople. The Sultan had humbled kingdoms, destroyed empires, and now commanded one of the largest armies in the world. For decades, Wallachian princes had survived by paying tribute and bowing before the Ottoman court. But Vlad, hardened by his childhood captivity, rejected this path. Submission was not in his nature. When imperial envoys arrived demanding payment, the encounter turned into legend. The messengers, bowing before the Wallachian throne, refused to remove their turbans, citing custom. The prince studied them, then declared that he would help them honor their tradition permanently. Iron spikes were brought, and the turbans nailed to their skulls. The men died in agony, their corpses displayed as warning. This act was not just cruelty, it was a declaration. The dragon's son would not kneel before the empire. The Sultan could not ignore such provocation. Wallachia lay on the frontier of Christian Europe, a buffer state between Ottoman expansion and Hungarian resistance. To defy the conqueror of Constantinople was to invite annihilation. Yet Vlad did not wait for the blow to fall. He struck first. In the winter of 1461, his forces crossed the frozen Danube. Villages under Ottoman control burned, and garrisons were wiped out. Chronicles report staggering numbers. More than 20,000 killed in these raids. Turks and Bulgarians alike. Entire communities were destroyed. The riverside settlements, accustomed to shifting masters, now witnessed slaughter on a scale designed to send shockwaves back to Constantinople. The voivode's strategy was clear: terror as defense. Where others raised walls, he built forests of corpses. Captives were skewered on stakes, lining the roadsides in gruesome procession. Travelers and survivors carried the stories back, spreading his reputation through fear more effective than any fortress. His letters to Matthias Corvinus, King of Hungary, boasted of the carnage. He presented himself as a defender of Christendom, striking down the infidel for the sake of the Holy Crown. But whether for faith or vengeance, the brutality was the same. The raids continued into 1462, each more devastating than the last. Ottoman strongholds fell one after another, their defenders executed in ways meant to horrify. Smoke rose across the Danube plain. The Wallachian ruler, once a hostage of the Turks, now repaid his captors with merciless slaughter. His soldiers, though fewer in number, moved swiftly, burning supplies, poisoning wells, and leaving nothing useful for the enemy. It was the same scorched earth that the great conquerors of Asia had used, but with an added cruelty that would forever mark Vlad's name. Among the Turks, fear spread. Rumors circulated of the Wallachian prince who killed without mercy, who impaled whole villages, who fought not as a noble commander, but as a butcher. Yet the Sultan was not easily intimidated. Mehmed had taken Constantinople, a city once thought impregnable. He commanded tens of thousands of troops, fleets on the Black Sea, and resources stretching across 3 continents. To him, Wallachia was a rebellious province to be chastised, nothing more. Still, the stories of massacres could not be ignored. Advisors urged Mehmed to march north in force, to crush the impudent voivode and replace him with a more obedient ruler. The Sultan had a candidate ready, Radu the Handsome, the younger brother who had remained loyal to the Ottoman court. Handsome, charming, and pliant, Radu seemed the perfect foil to his defiant sibling. By 1462, the confrontation was inevitable. Vlad, however, prepared as best he could. He knew his army was small compared to the legions the empire could muster. His only chance lay in fear, in scorched earth, and in night raids that could disorient a larger foe. As he readied his defenses, he filled the roads and fields with sharpened stakes, creating killing grounds meant to slow the invaders. He emptied villages, driving peasants into the forests so that no supplies would remain. Every bridge, every pass, was prepared as a trap. Letters from the period reveal his mindset. He declared proudly that he fought for the honor of the crown of Hungary and for Christendom. But beneath the rhetoric was a deeper, personal motive. He fought not only as a defender of Europe, but as a man repaying childhood humiliation. Every Turk slain was vengeance for the years he had spent as a hostage, for the humiliation of his father, for the betrayal that had cost his family their lives. The stage was set for one of the most extraordinary clashes of the 15th century. Mehmed II gathered his forces, an army said to be more than 150,000 strong, second only to the host that had taken Constantinople. The conqueror intended to march into Wallachia, overthrow Draculia, and install the obedient Radu in his place. The campaign would bring fire and blood to the valleys of the Danube and culminate in one of the most nightmarish battles Europe had ever seen. For now, though, Wallachia waited, bracing itself for the storm. Fields lay blackened, villages emptied, and on the borders, the sharpened stakes stood ready. In the summer heat of 1462, the Sultan's banners appeared on the horizon. The dragon's son had chosen terror as his fortress. Soon he would test whether forests of the dead could withstand the might of an empire. The screams began just after midnight. In the endless sprawl of the Ottoman camp, soldiers woke to chaos. Torches flared, arrows whistled through canvas walls, and horses bolted into the dark. Amid the din, some swore they saw a rider in black armor, shouting his name as a curse and a promise, Draculaea. Whether the figure was real or a phantom, the terror it caused was enough. Panic surged like fire through dry grass, and an army that had conquered Constantinople trembled in its sleep. Weeks of torment built to this moment. Mehmed II, relentless in his aim to topple the Wallachian prince, drove one of the mightiest armies in Europe across the Danube. Chroniclers estimated more than 150,000 men marched under his banners. Janissaries, Sipahis, artillery crews, auxiliaries from across the empire. The force was so vast that villages emptied in terror long before the soldiers arrived, leaving the land desolate. Yet for all their numbers, the conqueror's men soon discovered they were entering not a country, but a death trap. The Wallachian voivode had prepared carefully. Knowing he could not withstand the Sultan in open battle, he ordered a scorched earth retreat. Villages were evacuated, crops torched, granaries destroyed. Wells were poisoned with corpses of animals. Bridges were broken, roads blocked with felled trees. As the Ottomans advanced, they found only smoke, ruin, and silence. The land itself seemed to recoil from them. Small detachments that strayed from the main host vanished, cut down by sudden raids. Supplies grew scarce, disease spread among the exhausted troops. Each night, the Wallachians struck from the forests, killing, burning, and retreating into the darkness. Fear began to gnaw at the Sultan's men, for their enemy was nowhere and everywhere at once. And then came the night of June 16th. Guided by spies who had mapped the camp, Vlad led a hand-picked force of several thousand horsemen into the enemy's heart. They carried torches, fire arrows, and a single aim: to reach the Sultan's tent. If Mehmed II could be killed, the campaign would collapse in chaos. The assault was sudden and terrifying. Wallachian riders charged through the outer lines, shouting war cries, striking down guards before they could sound the alarm. Fires sprang up across the camp. Tents collapsed, crushing men inside. Horses screamed as arrows pierced them, adding to the tumult. Soldiers woke to confusion. Comrades mistaken for foes. Officers cut down before they could rally their units. Vlad himself drove the assault deep into the camp, though stories differ on how near he came to the Sultan's pavilion. Some say he reached the very perimeter before being driven back. Others claim Mehmed narrowly escaped death, spirited away by his Janissary guard as Wallachians cut through the surrounding tents. What is certain is that the assault left thousands of Ottomans dead and the rest shaken to their core. For hours, the greatest army in Europe fought shadows, convinced that death rode among them. At dawn, the scale of the slaughter was revealed. The ground was littered with corpses, charred wagons, and broken equipment. Survivors muttered of demons, convinced that no mortal prince could have dared such an attack. The conqueror of Constantinople had survived, but his aura of invincibility had been pierced. And still worse awaited him. As the army pressed north toward Târgoviște, it entered a valley prepared by the Wallachians. There, stretching for miles, stood a nightmare beyond imagining. 20,000 bodies impaled on wooden stakes, men, women, even children, all skewered and left to rot under the sun. Some were soldiers captured in battle, others villagers accused of aiding the Turks, and many more simply victims of the ruler's policy of terror. Birds nested in the corpses. Wolves prowled the edges. The stench was unbearable. Chroniclers tell us that even the Sultan, hardened by years of war, recoiled. One account has him declaring that it was impossible to unseat a man who could commit such horrors, for such a ruler commanded not only soldiers, but fear itself. His troops were less philosophical. They were horrified, and many refused to advance further into what they now called a land of death. The strategy had worked. Fear was the voivode's fortress. He could not outnumber his enemy, but he could unnerve them. The night raid and the forest of corpses were meant to crush morale, and for a time they succeeded. Mehmed withdrew his main army south of the Danube, unwilling to press deeper into such hostile ground. But victory came at a cost. The peasants who had seen their villages burned and their fields destroyed began to waver. Starving and homeless, many deserted to his brother Radu, who promised an easier rule under Ottoman protection. Radu was handsome, charming, and pliant, everything his elder was not. With imperial backing, he quickly gathered followers. The voivode's terror could hold an enemy at bay, but it could not secure the loyalty of a weary people. Abroad, stories of the campaign spread like wildfire. In Saxon towns across Transylvania, pamphlets recounted the horrors, portraying Vlad as a monster who drank blood and delighted in torment. In Western courts, the night attack was hailed as a miracle. A petty principality had defied the empire, but the miracle was double-edged, for it left the prince isolated, feared as much by allies as by enemies. The summer of 1462 was the zenith of his power. He had faced the might of the Ottoman Empire and lived. He had terrified the greatest conqueror of his age, yet the seeds of his downfall were already sprouting. His people, exhausted by war, drifted toward his brother. His allies in Hungary hesitated to support a ruler whose methods shocked even hardened warriors. For the dragon's son, the campaign had proven his principle. Fear was stronger than numbers, terror more potent than walls. But as he would soon learn, fear also had limits. When it turned against him, no stake forest could hold it back. In the summer of 1462, his power reached its peak, even as ruin crept silently over Wallachia. The land lay wasted from months of scorched earth. Villages were blackened husks, fields turned to ash, wells fouled with carrion. To the Sultan's soldiers, it had been a nightmare. To the peasants who lived there, it was a slow death. Harvests were gone, winter loomed, and the ruler who had promised protection offered only more hardship. The fear that had once kept his people loyal began to turn sour. Boyars who had bent the knee under duress remembered old grudges. Villagers who had followed him into battle now slipped away under cover of night. And in the south, the empire prepared its answer. Mehmed had withdrawn his main host, but he had not given up. He left behind a weapon sharper than any sword, Vlad's own brother. Radu, long a favorite of the Ottoman court, returned to Wallachia as the Sultan's chosen prince. Handsome, gracious, and promising leniency, he offered what his brother could not: peace. Tribute would be paid, the empire obeyed, but in exchange the people would eat, the villages would recover, and life would resume. Exhausted by war, many found the bargain acceptable. Boyars who feared the stake saw in Radu a ruler who would forgive them. Peasants saw in him an end to fire and famine. The split widened quickly. Each week, more nobles defected. Each month, more peasants crossed to the rival camp. Vlad fought desperately to stem the tide. He led raids into villages that supported his brother, slaughtering and burning as before. But each act of cruelty drove others into Radu's arms. Terror, once his greatest weapon, was becoming his undoing. By late autumn, his position was crumbling. The Ottomans supplied his brother with gold, men, and legitimacy, while his own army dwindled. Surrounded, he retreated into the Carpathians, clinging to mountain fortresses and forest paths. Loyalists followed him, but hunger and despair thinned their numbers. Tales speak of desperate marches through snow, of bands of men reduced to raiding for food, of betrayals whispered in the dark. Still, Vlad was not without hope. Across the mountains lay Hungary, where Matthias Corvinus sat on the throne. The Hungarian king had long styled himself a defender of Christendom. Surely he would recognize the value of a prince who had defied Mehmed II, who had dared to raid across the Danube, who had come within heartbeats of killing the Sultan in his own camp. Carrying letters filled with boasts of his victories, Vlad rode north, convinced he would be greeted as a hero. He miscalculated. The Hungarian court had no appetite for a war against the empire, not after years of costly campaigns. Merchants from Transylvanian towns filled Corvinus's ears with complaints. Trade disrupted, caravans slaughtered, relatives impaled. Diplomatic envoys whispered of Vlad's instability, his cruelty, his unreliability. The Saxon cities, bitter from their burned villages, spread stories of his atrocities. In this climate, support for the Wallachian prince was scarce. To justify what came next, Corvinus produced forged letters, documents suggesting that Vlad had secretly offered to ally with the Sultan. Whether the king himself believed them is doubtful, but they provided convenient cover. Instead of welcoming a champion, he imprisoned him. The man who had turned back the conqueror of Constantinople was marched away in chains. The fall was staggering. Only months earlier, he had filled valleys with impaled corpses and sent the Sultan retreating. Now he was a captive in a foreign land, his fate decided not by his enemies, but by supposed allies. For Wallachia, the change was swift. Radu, backed by Ottoman troops, took the throne unopposed. He restored tribute payments, courted the Boyars with promises of leniency, and tried to repair the shattered countryside. Many accepted him readily. Others feared him less than they had feared his brother. The terror that had defined Vlad's reign gave way to a quieter, more pliant rule, at least while Ottoman strength stood behind it. In Hungary, the captive prince lingered in obscurity. Some sources suggest he was confined in a fortress, under close guard, treated as a dangerous liability. Others claim he enjoyed a degree of freedom, even marrying into Hungarian nobility during his captivity. The truth likely lies somewhere in between, a prisoner too notorious to execute, too unpredictable to trust, and too valuable as a bargaining chip to release. For the man himself, the betrayal must have burned. He had risked everything to strike at the empire, and in return, he was abandoned by his people, replaced by his brother, and caged by the king he had expected to honor him. Fear, his greatest weapon, had failed him. Worse still, it had begun to work against him. And yet, though his voice was silenced, his legend was not. Even as he languished in captivity, the stories spread, of forests of the dead, of merchants skewered for cheating, of golden cups left untouched because no thief dared steal. In German towns, pamphlets carried his name far beyond the Carpathians. In Slavic lands, monks copied tales of his justice and cruelty. Vlad the Impaler, prisoner though he was becoming immortal in rumor. The Zenith had passed. The collapse was complete. The man who had shaken empires now stared at stone walls and iron bars. But history had not finished with him yet. The fall had been swift. Only months earlier, Vlad had led daring raids against the Sultan himself, striking terror into the largest army in Europe. Now he sat behind stone walls, stripped of command, abandoned by allies, and replaced on the Wallachian throne by his younger brother. His fate seemed sealed, a dangerous relic of the past, stored away where he could do no more harm. Accounts of his captivity differ wildly. Some claim he was locked in the fortress of Visegrad, its towers rising above the Danube, chained in a cell and watched day and night. Others suggest he lived in semi-freedom, kept under guard, but allowed to move within the castle grounds, even to hunt. A few chroniclers wrote that he later lived at Buda, the Hungarian capital, as a kind of noble prisoner. The truth is uncertain, but one detail is clear. He was not permitted to return to Wallachia, nor to play a role in the wars shaking the frontier. Yet even confined, he remained unsettling. One story tells of him passing time by catching mice and rats in his cell, cutting them into pieces or impaling them on splinters. Whether invention or truth, the image fit too well with his reputation to be ignored. To contemporaries, the tale suggested that cruelty was not only his method of rule, but his very nature. If prisons silenced him politically, it amplified him culturally. In the German-speaking lands of Transylvania and beyond, the new technology of the printing press carried his name farther than his armies ever had. Pamphlets poured from presses in cities like Nuremberg, filled with lurid stories of sadism. They described him boiling people alive, cutting off limbs, roasting victims, even eating their flesh. One account claimed he dipped his bread in the blood of the impaled, feasting as their bodies writhed on stakes. Illustrated woodcuts showed him at banquets surrounded by forests of corpses, calmly dining as though cruelty were a form of entertainment. To the burghers of Saxon towns who had suffered his wrath in the 1450s, these tales were both revenge and warning. To distant readers in Germany or Austria, they transformed a regional prince into a figure of mythic monstrosity. At the same time, in Slavic lands, a different image was taking shape. Russian manuscripts described him as merciless but just, a man who punished dishonesty and theft with unrelenting severity. They repeated the story of the golden cup left at a fountain, safe from thieves, because none dared risk his punishments. They told of merchants who tried to cheat their customers and were executed on the spot. To these writers, he was terrifying, but also incorruptible, a ruler who brought order to a land where chaos had long reigned. The contradiction was striking. In the West, he was a vampire before vampires existed, a sadist who bathed in blood. In the East, he was remembered as a stern guardian of justice, brutal but effective. Both portraits shared one feature. They agreed he was not ordinary. Whether monster or lawgiver, he was larger than life. Meanwhile, Wallachia moved on without him. Radu, the handsome brother, ruled under Ottoman supervision. He paid tribute regularly, courted the nobles with promises of leniency, and avoided the extremes of his sibling. Yet he never inspired the same awe. His reign depended on the empire's backing, and without Turkish troops his power was fragile. For all his charm, he remained in his brother's shadow, remembered more for pliancy than for strength. Vlad, by contrast, was becoming immortal in rumor. The printing press gave him a reach no Wallachian prince had ever achieved. His name was spoken in taverns in Vienna, whispered in monasteries in Novgorod, printed in pamphlets in Nuremberg. Each retelling made him more terrifying, more grotesque, more unforgettable. Even in Hungary, where he was a prisoner, his notoriety grew. Matthias Corvinus had justified his imprisonment with forged letters, claiming he had offered to betray Christendom to the Sultan. But the longer he lived, the more useful he became as a symbol. To critics of Corvinus, he was proof of the king's cowardice. Why cage a man who had stood against Mehmed? To others, he was a reminder of what unchecked cruelty looked like, a monster preserved as a warning. For Vlad himself, the years dragged on. He was cut off from his land, powerless to shape events, forced to watch as his brother held the throne that he believed was his birthright. If he raged at the betrayal, history does not record it. But one can imagine the bitterness of a man who had once terrified the Sultan himself, reduced to irrelevance while his legend ran free without him. And that legend only grew stronger. The paradox of his captivity was that the less he acted, the more he was spoken of. He no longer commanded armies, yet his name carried more power than ever. He was alive, but sidelined, silenced yet omnipresent. He had lost his throne, but he was becoming immortal. By the mid-1470s, the Ottomans pressed harder than ever against the Hungarian frontier. Stephen of Moldavia, fighting desperate battles to preserve his principality, remembered the ally of his youth. In 1475, he urged Corvinus to release the dragon's son, a man who had once turned back the conqueror of Constantinople, Stephen argued, could not be left in chains while the frontier burned. Victory came at last. After long years of confinement, the Impaler stepped into the world again. For more than a decade, he had lived in silence, a prisoner whose name had grown louder with each passing year. Vlad had been chained, confined, or kept under watch while his brother ruled in his place. He was mocked in German pamphlets, transformed into a monster in woodcuts, and remembered in Slavic tales as both cruel and just. Yet in the late 1470s, Europe could no longer afford to keep him locked away. The Ottoman frontier was aflame. Since the fall of Constantinople, the empire had pressed ever deeper into the Balkans, swallowing Serbia, threatening Bosnia, and battering at Moldavia. Christian powers were divided, each fighting its own battles, each too weak to face the Sultan alone. It was Stephen of Moldavia who saw what others refused to admit. However terrible Vlad had been, he was also a man who had once terrified Mehmed II himself. If the frontier was to hold, the Impaler must return. Stephen pressed Matthias Corvinus, the Hungarian king, to release the Wallachian prince. Corvinus had his doubts. He had imprisoned Vlad precisely because he was unpredictable, dangerous, and difficult to control. His reputation made him as much a liability as an asset. But times had changed. Hungarian prestige had suffered under Ottoman pressure, and Matthias needed strong men on the border. With Moldavia demanding it and the empire threatening from the south, the king relented. In 1475, the man who had once filled valleys with corpses walked free again. His return to politics was cautious. He was no longer the young claimant of the 1450s, charging into battle with reckless energy. He was older now, scarred by years of confinement, aware that his survival depended on careful alliances. He tied himself firmly to Hungary by marrying Justina Szilágyi, a woman of noble blood and a relative of the king himself. The marriage bound him to Matthias's family, giving him legitimacy among Hungarian nobles who would otherwise have doubted him. It also provided a measure of protection. To imprison or betray him again would now mean dishonoring kin. Marriage was only the beginning. He had to prove himself useful, not just dangerous. His chance came quickly. In 1476, Hungarian and Serbian forces prepared a campaign into Bosnia, striking at Ottoman garrisons and towns that threatened the frontier. Vlad joined them eagerly. For him, it was both a test and a statement. He was no relic, no forgotten captive. He was still a warrior prince, and his methods had not changed. The campaign was fierce. Ottoman forts were stormed, villages put to the torch, and prisoners executed in ways that bore his unmistakable signature. Captured soldiers were impaled, their corpses displayed as warnings to others. Civilians, accused of aiding the Turks, were slaughtered or driven away in chains. To his allies, hardened by years of war, the cruelty was difficult to watch. Some whispered that the Impaler had lost none of his savagery during captivity. Yet others admitted that his reputation worked. Towns surrendered quickly when they heard his name. Fear was still his weapon, and it still achieved results. But the campaign was about more than battlefield victories. It was about demonstrating to Hungary and Moldavia that he was still relevant, still powerful, still a man worth supporting. Every town that fell, every garrison broken, was proof that the Impaler had returned. Still, allies viewed him with unease. Matthias Corvinus, who had once jailed him, could not entirely trust him. The Hungarian court remembered too clearly the stories of forests of the impaled, of merchants skewered for minor infractions, of endless cruelty. Even as they used him, they kept him at arm's length. He was useful as a weapon, but dangerous as a neighbor. Stephen of Moldavia, on the other hand, understood him better. The Moldavian prince had fought his own desperate wars against the empire. He knew that survival on the frontier demanded ferocity. For Stephen, Vlad was not a liability, but an ally, one who could strengthen the borderlands and provide a buffer between Moldavia and the Turks. He pressed harder for Vlad's restoration, insisting that Wallachia could not be left in Ottoman hands. For Vlad himself, the Bosnian campaign was only a prelude. His thoughts remained fixed on Wallachia, the throne taken from him, the rivals installed by the empire. Basarab Laiota still ruled there, an Ottoman-backed prince whose loyalty was to the Sultan, not to his people. To Vlad, this was intolerable. Wallachia was his inheritance, his birthright, and he meant to reclaim it. The road to restoration, however, was not simple. He needed Hungarian approval, Moldavian support, and the cooperation of the very Boyars who had betrayed him before. To win them over, he alternated between promises and threats. He assured Matthias that he would remain a faithful ally, a bulwark against the empire. He swore to Stephen that he would stand as a Christian defender on the frontier. And to the Boyars, he reminded them of the cost of disloyalty, hinting at stakes and executions if they dared betray him again. By the summer of 1476, the plan was clear. Hungary, Moldavia, and Vlad's followers would march into Wallachia. Basarab would be driven out. Vlad would be restored for a third time, his throne reclaimed after more than a decade in chains. The armies gathered, the banners raised, and the march began. For Vlad, the moment was heavy with meaning. He had been abandoned, betrayed, and caged. He had been mocked as a monster and remembered as a tyrant. Now, after years of waiting, he was returning to his homeland not as a fugitive, but as a prince restored by Christian allies. He would not waste the chance. The Impaler was coming home. The armies marched in autumn. From Hungary came the banners of Matthias Corvinus, the black raven stitched on gold. From Moldavia came Stephen the Great, whose reputation as a relentless defender of his principality was already legendary. Between them rode the man who had spent more than a decade in chains. Older now, his hair touched with grey, but still carrying the grim determination that had once terrified the greatest conqueror of the age. For the first time since 1462, Vlad was returning to Wallachia with strength at his back. The campaign of 1476 was carefully orchestrated. The Allies crossed the Carpathians through mountain passes, bringing Hungarian knights, Moldavian infantry, and smaller bands of Wallachian exiles who had never accepted Ottoman rule. Their target was Basarab Laiota, the Ottoman-backed prince who had worn the crown in Vlad's absence. Without the empire's main forces beside him, Basarab could not match the combined strength of Hungary and Moldavia. He retreated, leaving fortified towns behind to slow the invaders. The march was relentless. Villages opened their gates, some in hope, others in fear. In towns like Bucharest, people remembered the order Vlad had once imposed, harsh, merciless, but predictable. Merchants whispered of the safety of his roads when thieves were skewered without hesitation. Others remembered only the stake fields and the massacres. Every family had a story, a brother punished, a cousin executed, a neighbor lost. His return was both hope and terror, and the population bent before him uncertainly, unsure whether to celebrate or hide. By November, Bucharest fell, followed soon after by Târgoviște. Basarab fled south toward Ottoman protection. Vlad entered his old capital, a city scarred by war and haunted by memory. It had been more than a decade since he had walked those halls. Now, with Hungarian and Moldavian banners flying alongside his own, he reclaimed the throne. The coronation was held with as much ceremony as the shattered land could muster. Nobles gathered in their finest robes, priests intoned prayers, bells rang across the city. Chroniclers described banners fluttering, oaths sworn, the crown once more set upon his head. For the man himself, it was vindication. After years of humiliation, betrayal, and captivity, he was again what he had always claimed to be, Prince of Wallachia. Yet the celebration carried a bitter undercurrent. The Boyars bowed, but their eyes betrayed unease. Many had lost relatives to his purges 2 decades earlier. Some had watched their families marched off to rebuild mountain fortresses as prisoners. They swore loyalty now, but their oaths were fragile. In their hearts, they feared that the days of executions and wooden stakes might return. The land itself was weary. Decades of fighting had left villages burned, fields barren, and trade disrupted. The peasants had endured famine during his scorched earth campaigns, and though many admired him for standing against the Turks, they dreaded the suffering his wars always brought. To them, the restoration was not triumph, but uncertainty, a question of whether this ruler would bring stability or more ruin. Vlad knew he had little time. He moved quickly to reassert authority. Suspected traitors were punished, rivals silenced. Executions were carried out, though perhaps not on the scale of his earlier purges. His message was unmistakable. Betrayal would not be tolerated. To some, this was reassurance. To others, it was confirmation that the old cruelty had returned. But his power rested on borrowed strength. His throne had been restored by Hungarian and Moldavian armies, not by his own. Once those allies withdrew, he would stand exposed. Matthias Corvinus had no interest in letting him grow too powerful. To the Hungarian king, Vlad was a tool, useful as long as he kept Wallachia hostile to the Ottomans, but dangerous if he tried to act independently. Stephen of Moldavia supported him more sincerely, but even he expected loyalty above all else. Vlad ruled, but under watchful eyes. Beyond his borders, enemies gathered. Basarab Laiota had retreated, but he had not been defeated. With Ottoman backing, he regrouped quickly. Mehmed II had not forgotten the forests of the impaled, nor forgiven the man who had once raided his lands and threatened his life. To the Sultan, the restoration of his old enemy was intolerable. Soon Basarab would return with imperial soldiers at his side. Inside Wallachia, divisions deepened. Some nobles leaned toward Radu's old faction, preferring the pliant brother who had at least spared them. Others plotted quietly, waiting for the moment to betray the returning prince. Even common peasants were divided. They admired his courage, but dreaded his methods. The Golden Cup story was still told, but so were tales of entire villages impaled for minor offenses. Every memory of order carried the shadow of fear. The winter of 1476 to 77 was uneasy. The capital buzzed with rumors of conspiracies, boyars whispering behind closed doors, envoys slipping across borders. Vlad tried to re-establish the discipline of his earlier reign, but the land was too fractured, the loyalties too uncertain. His allies withdrew, returning to their own lands, leaving him with a fragile crown and a restless realm. For a man who had once struck fear into the heart of Mehmed II, it must have felt like standing on sand. He had regained the title, but not the authority. He wore the crown, but its weight pressed more heavily than before. His throne was surrounded not by faithful subjects, but by wary nobles and waiting enemies. Still, for those brief weeks, he was again what he believed destiny demanded: ruler of Wallachia, heir to Mircea the Elder, son of Dracul. His journey from hostage, exile, and prisoner had come full circle. He had fallen further than most princes ever would, and risen again to reclaim his place. But even as the crown glittered on his head, the storm gathered on the horizon. Basarab was returning. The empire was stirring. Inside his own walls, trust was scarce. The third reign of Vlad Dracula had begun, and already it was beginning to end. The crown glittered on his head once more, but already it felt heavier than ever. In November 1476, Vlad had been restored to his throne by Hungarian and Moldavian allies. He entered Târgoviște with ceremony, banners raised, bells tolling, and priests chanting blessings. For a man who had spent more than a decade in captivity, it was vindication. He had survived betrayal, imprisonment, and years of slander, and yet he was again Prince of Wallachia. But his triumph was fragile. The nobles swore loyalty at his coronation, but their eyes betrayed unease. Many had lost relatives to his purges. Others still bore scars of forced labor on the mountain fortress of Poinari. They bowed out of necessity, not conviction. Peasants too were ambivalent. Some remembered the order he had once imposed, when thieves dared not steal and merchants dared not cheat. But others recalled only famine, villages torched in scorched earth campaigns and endless bloodshed. The prince was back, but the people were tired. He ruled for only weeks, yet even in that short span, he tried to reassert his authority. Suspected traitors were punished, plots suppressed, loyalty demanded with severity. Some executions followed, though on a smaller scale than the mass purges of earlier years. He was older now, more cautious, and dependent on allies who would not tolerate wholesale slaughter. Still, he needed to remind Boyars that betrayal carried consequences. The memory of the stake lingered over every court session. Beyond Wallachia, the danger was greater still. Basarab Lyota had fled during the invasion, but quickly regrouped with Ottoman support. Mehmed II, enraged by the restoration of his old enemy, would not allow the Impaler to hold power for long. The Sultan had not forgotten the forests of the dead outside Târgoviște, or the night when Wallachian horsemen nearly reached his tent. For him, Vlad's return was not merely an insult, but a threat. Ottoman gold and troops flowed once more to Basarab. The counterstrike was inevitable. The winter campaign was bitter and chaotic. Snow fell across the valleys, and armies slogged through mud and ice. Skirmishes broke out across the countryside. Villages were raided, loyalties tested, nobles forced to choose. Some joined Vlad out of conviction or fear. Others defected to Basarab, convinced that Ottoman support would prevail. The land fractured, half supporting the prince, half turning against him. Vlad fought as he always had. From the front, he led his men in person, refusing to hide behind walls. Chroniclers note his courage in riding with small detachments, striking at enemy columns, ambushing where he could. Yet his numbers were thin, supplies dwindling, and morale fragile. Each week brought desertions. Each battle cost him more of the soldiers he could not replace. By December, the confrontation could no longer be delayed. Near Snagov, north of Bucharest, the final clash came. The exact details are lost to history, preserved only in contradictory accounts. Some said he fought with reckless bravery, charging into enemy lines, cutting down foes until he was overwhelmed. Others claimed he was betrayed in his own camp, cut down by assassins bribed to finish what armies could not. A Russian chronicle offered a grim irony that he was mistaken for a Turk by his own men who killed him in the confusion of battle. Whatever the truth, he did not survive the winter. His body, hacked and broken, was buried hastily near the battlefield. Tradition holds that monks at Snagov Monastery carried him to their island sanctuary for burial, though excavations centuries later found no convincing evidence of his remains. Another account places his grave at Komana, a monastery he himself had founded, closer to where he fell. His true resting place remains a mystery. His head, however, was claimed without doubt. Preserved in honey or tar, it was sent to Constantinople and displayed above the gates of the city. For the Sultan, it was revenge and proof. The man who had once dared to defy him, who had lined roads with impaled soldiers, who had boasted of striking terror into the empire, was gone. Citizens of the capital filed past the grisly trophy, seeing not just a severed head, but the fall of a figure who had embodied resistance to Ottoman might. The symbolism was unmistakable. The impaler, who had ruled by fear, was himself reduced to a spectacle of fear. Just as he had left corpses along roadsides to intimidate his enemies, now his head was displayed to reassure the empire that vengeance had been taken. His life ended as it had been lived, in violence, in horror, and in spectacle. News of his death spread quickly. In Hungary, Matthias Corvinus could breathe easier. He had supported Vlad's restoration as a tool, but had never truly trusted him. With the impaler gone, Hungary no longer risked the embarrassment of controlling a prince infamous for cruelty. In Moldavia, Stephen lost an ally, but gained a lesson. Even ferocity could not withstand betrayal and overwhelming force. In Wallachia, peasants and boyars alike adjusted once more to a change of ruler, weary of the endless cycle of princes rising and falling. But abroad, the reaction was more complicated. In German towns, the pamphlets that had once described his atrocities now gained an ending. The monster was dead, slain at last, his head displayed like those of his countless victims. In Slavic lands, stories took on a mournful tone. The cruel but just ruler who had kept order was gone, leaving the land to weaker men. To the Sultan, he was a conquered foe. To his enemies, a tyrant destroyed. To his admirers, a tragic defender of Christendom cut down too soon. The truth was simpler. His reign had ended as it had begun, with treachery, bloodshed, and uncertainty. He had returned from captivity, reclaimed his throne, and ruled for only weeks before falling. His enemies had been too many, his people too weary, his allies too cautious. And yet, even in death, he was not silenced. His head on a stake in Constantinople was not an ending, but a transformation. The man was gone, but the legend was stronger than ever. Tales of his cruelty, his justice, his defiance of the Sultan spread faster than before. His story was no longer confined to Wallachia or the Balkans. It was becoming European, even universal. The last winter of Vlad Dracula had passed. The throne of Wallachia belonged once more to Ottoman clients, and the dragon's son lay in an unmarked grave. But in pamphlets, chronicles, and rumours, he still lived. Part 13 would belong not to the man, but to the memory he left behind. The gates of Constantinople bore many trophies in the 15th century, but few drew crowds like the one displayed in early 1477. Tarred to preserve it, the severed head of Vlad Dracula stared blankly over the city, lips curled back from teeth as if still snarling at the world. To the Sultan, it was proof. To his court, it was vengeance. To the citizens who gathered to gawk, it was the end of a nightmare. For Mehmed II, the victory was personal. Years earlier, he had marched into Wallachia with an army that had toppled Constantinople itself, only to find his soldiers sickened by scorched earth, his camp thrown into chaos by a midnight raid, and his eyes forced to take in a valley of 20,000 impaled corpses. No other enemy had humiliated him so deeply. Now the head of that enemy, pickled in tar, grinned from a stake above the gates of his capital. The conqueror had the last word. Back in Wallachia, the throne passed easily to Basarab Laiota, restored with Ottoman soldiers at his side. Tribute flowed south again. The principality settled back into the role of client state, a fragile buffer at the edge of empires. Few peasants resisted. After decades of war, famine, and punishment, exhaustion outweighed defiance. Princes came and went. What mattered was surviving the seasons. But the memory of Vlad's rule lingered like a scar. Among common people, opinions split sharply. Many gave thanks that the days of forests of stakes and endless executions were over. They remembered fields burned on his orders, villages emptied for scorched earth defense, famine gnawing at their bellies while their prince obsessed over discipline. His death, for them, meant relief. Yet others whispered of his justice with admiration. They recalled that under him, the roads had been safe. A merchant could travel without fear of brigands. A cup of gold could stand at a fountain and remain untouched. Petty nobles dared not extort peasants. Corrupt officials feared discovery. They admitted he was merciless, but they insisted he had ruled fairly, punishing rich and poor alike. For them, his fall meant the return of lawless times. The Boyars had their own reckoning. Many had survived his purges by luck or submission. They remembered brothers skewered, cousins enslaved, fathers executed for plots real or imagined. They greeted his death with relief. Yet even among them, unease lingered. Under his terror, Wallachia had been briefly independent, its nobles forced to serve a prince instead of scheming with foreigners. Now, under Basarab, their survival was purchased with tribute to Constantinople. Freedom had come at a terrible cost. Submission came at a quieter one. In Hungary, Matthias Corvinus received the news with satisfaction. He had reluctantly restored Vlad to power as a weapon against the Turks, but never trusted him. His notoriety made him difficult to control, and his cruelty repelled allies. With him gone, the Hungarian crown no longer had to manage a dangerous but useful tool. In Moldavia, Stephen the Great mourned the loss. He had pushed hardest for Vlad's release, believing a strong Wallachia was essential for resisting the empire. Now he stood alone, his southern flank once again controlled by an Ottoman client. If politics moved on quickly, culture did not. Vlad's death unleashed a flood of stories that raced across Europe faster than any army could march. In German-speaking lands, where the printing press was remaking communication, his reputation exploded. Pamphlets poured from presses in Nuremberg, Lübeck, Vienna, and beyond. The most famous, Geschichte Dracula recounted cruelties in lurid detail. He was said to roast men alive, mutilate women, cut off noses and ears, and impale thousands. One tale claimed he invited beggars to a feast, then locked the hall and burned them alive, declaring he would rid the land of poverty. Another insisted he forced mothers to eat their children, then executed them. A third claimed he dipped bread in blood at banquets, feasting amid corpses. These pamphlets were accompanied by woodcuts that seared themselves into the imagination. One shows him calmly dining at a table, while a forest of impaled bodies writhes around him. Another depicts him watching dispassionately as victims are mutilated. They were sensational, grotesque, and unforgettable. Cheaply printed, they spread across German towns, carried to marketplaces, taverns, and courts. For German readers, he was not just a tyrant. He was the embodiment of the frontier's horrors. They lived under constant threat of Ottoman raids, hearing rumors of massacres and enslavements. Vlad's atrocities, whether real or invented, were shaped into a mirror of that fear. He was made into a monster from the borderlands, proof that the East was a place of chaos and cruelty. In Slavic lands, however, the memory was different. Russian manuscripts described him as a ruler of iron justice. They repeated the story of the Golden Cup, a symbol of perfect order. They praised his incorruptibility, punishing officials who took bribes as harshly as thieves. They described him as chosen by God to scourge evil, even if his methods were terrifying. To these writers, he was not a sadist, but a necessary tyrant, a prince who defended Christian law against disorder. This paradox was striking. In the West, he became a demon in human form, a blood drinker, a carnival of cruelty. In the East, he was respected as a stern lawgiver, feared but admired. Both views agreed on his brutality. Neither could see him as ordinary. Even the spectacle in Constantinople carried this duality. To the Sultan, the tarred head was a triumph. To his subjects, it was reassurance that the empire had defeated its most troublesome enemy. Yet to others, the very need to display it confirmed how dangerous he had been. No common foe was given such treatment. Only a man who had terrified the conqueror of Constantinople himself warranted such display. By the end of the 15th century, Vlad had become many things at once. To Wallachian peasants, he was both tyrant and protector. To nobles, he was both destroyer and unifier. To Hungarians, an unstable ally. To Moldavians, a lost partner. To the Sultan, a vanquished foe. To Germans, a monster. To Russians, a lawgiver. His name was no longer just history. It had become propaganda, legend, and myth. And so, the man who had died violently in a winter battle was already outliving himself. He had been remade into stories, each tailored to the needs and fears of those who told them. Some saw justice, others horror, all saw spectacle. This was the true legacy of Vlad the Impaler in the decades after his death. Not the policies he enacted, not the battles he fought, but the multiplicity of memories he left behind. He was no longer a single man. He was fragments stitched into rumor, pamphlet, and chronicle. A tyrant to one, a defender to another, a nightmare to all. The man had been destroyed on the battlefield. The stories had only begun to live, and in those stories lay the raw material of something greater still, a legend that, centuries later, would escape history entirely and stalk the imagination of the world. In the years after his death, Vlad Dracula became more famous than he had ever been in life. His reigns had been short, his victories fleeting, his defeats many. Yet the stories told about him took on a life of their own, spreading farther and faster than any of his armies had marched. If the battlefield had been his stage, the printing press was his immortality. By the late 1400s, German cities like Nuremberg, Lübeck, and Augsburg were producing cheap pamphlets for a growing reading public. They were the tabloids of their age, lurid, sensational, designed to shock, and no subject was more shocking than the Prince of Wallachia. His cruelty was described in ever greater detail, embroidered with invention, magnified until he became less man than monster. One pamphlet claimed he roasted men alive and cut them into pieces, laughing as he watched. Another told of him forcing mothers to eat their children before executing them. A third described him dipping bread in the blood of the dying. The stories were endless, each more grotesque than the last. They were accompanied by woodcuts that seared themselves into the imagination. Vlad dining calmly at a table, while impaled bodies writhe around him. Vlad ordering mutilations with cold detachment. Vlad surrounded by death as though cruelty itself were his court. These pamphlets spread widely, copied and recopied, passed from city to city. They were Europe's first true bestsellers, reaching audiences who had never heard of Wallachia, never seen the Carpathians, never known the man. For them, Dracula became synonymous with savagery, a name to whisper with shudders. Yet not all remembered him this way. In Slavic lands, monks copied manuscripts that told a different story. These accounts did not deny his cruelty. They acknowledged it in detail, but they presented it as the tool of a ruler who sought justice. They repeated the Golden Cup story, holding it up as proof of a land so safe that even a treasure could remain untouched. They praised his incorruptibility. Officials who took bribes were punished, thieves executed without hesitation, nobles disciplined like common peasants. For these chroniclers, he was not a sadist, but a scourge chosen by God to enforce order in a chaotic age. Wallachian folklore added yet another layer. Ballads and oral tales passed through villages, portraying him sometimes as a tyrant, sometimes as a protector. In one story, he punishes nobles who mistreat peasants. In another, he executes entire families for minor crimes. Over time, the memory of his reign became part of the identity of the land itself. A reminder that Wallachia had once been ruled by a man too cruel to forget, too strong to ignore. The Ottomans, too, remembered him. Chronicles from Constantinople portrayed him as a dangerous foe, cruel even by the standards of frontier warfare. For the empire, he was both a defeated enemy and a cautionary tale, proof that even a small principality could cause great harm if led by a man willing to embrace terror. His head had been displayed on a stake as triumph, but the memory of his resistance lingered as well. As the 16th century progressed, the figure of Vlad the Impaler appeared again and again in chronicles, travelers' accounts, and moral stories. Writers in Germany continued to emphasize his cruelty, turning him into an object lesson about the dangers of unchecked power. Russian scribes portrayed him as an archetype of harsh justice. In each retelling, the man grew further from history and closer to symbol. By the 17th and 18th centuries, as Europe's wars with the Ottomans continued, his story remained relevant. He was cited as an example of the brutality of the borderlands, a reminder of how violence shaped the frontier between empires. Yet as the centuries passed, his tale also became entertainment. The horror of his deeds was retold in taverns and markets, exaggerated with each generation, until he was less remembered as a prince than as a figure of nightmare. In the 19th century, with the rise of Romantic nationalism, his story was rediscovered by historians and folklorists. In Wallachia and Moldavia, scholars debated whether he had been a tyrant or a hero. Nationalists eager to claim proud defenders of the land pointed to his refusal to submit to the Ottomans, portraying him as a patriot centuries ahead of his time. In Germany and the West, writers focused on the grotesque, preserving him as the blood-soaked tyrant of the East. His name carried the weight of its own transformation. Dracula, derived from his father's title as a member of the Order of the Dragon, also echoed with the darker meaning of Drac, the devil. To his enemies, he had been the son of the dragon, the son of the devil. To later readers, the name alone conjured darkness. By the time Bram Stoker sat down to write his Gothic novel in the late 19th century, the ground had been prepared for centuries. German pamphlets had already turned Vlad into a creature of blood. Slavic tales had cast him as God's scourge, half demon and half lawgiver. Wallachian folklore had kept his name alive in song and story. Stoker did not need to invent Dracula from nothing. The raw material had been waiting, built over 400 years of memory, myth, and propaganda. The man had died in a winter battle near Snagov, but the legend that survived him was restless, protean, and enduring. He was many things to many people: tyrant, hero, protector, monster, patriot, demon. He was remembered in pamphlets, in chronicles, in folklore, and in rumor, and together these fragments fused into something larger than history. By the end of the 15th century, Vlad Dracula was no longer just a dead prince. He was already a legend. And by the 19th, he would become something else entirely. A vampire stalking the imagination of the world. In 1897, a theatre manager from Dublin published a Gothic novel. Bram Stoker had written plays, reviews, and stories before, but nothing that would prepare the world for the figure he unleashed. His book was titled Dracula, and with it, the Wallachian prince who had died in 1476 was reborn in a form stranger and more enduring than any chronicler of his age could have imagined. Stoker never set foot in Transylvania. He pieced together his novel from guidebooks, histories, and conversations with travelers. He mined folklore for stories of vampires, revenants who drank blood, crept from graves, and spread plague. But what transformed his draft from yet another Gothic horror into something unforgettable was a name. Dracula, derived from Vlad's father's title in the Order of the Dragon, already carried centuries of associations with devil, dragon, and cruelty. It was a name soaked in dread. The Count of Stoker's imagination was not a copy of Vlad the Impaler. His character lived for centuries, moved like a shadow, and fed on blood. He was aristocratic, hypnotic, and predatory. Yet there were echoes. German pamphlets had accused Vlad of dipping bread in human blood, of dining among corpses, of building forests of the dead. Stoker's Dracula fed on blood more literally. But the grotesque banquet scenes of those pamphlets hung behind the novel like a shadow. The historical prince had built his authority on fear. The fictional count spread terror in a new, supernatural form. At first, Dracula was only moderately successful. It joined the Gothic tradition, already crowded with haunted castles and restless spirits. But the character refused to die. In the early 20th century, the vampire left the page for the stage. Adaptations in London and New York gave him new life, sharpening his aristocratic menace. Then came the films. Nosferatu, 1922, though unauthorized, turned Dracula into a figure of plague, bald and rat-like, bringing pestilence across the sea. Bela Lugosi's 1931 performance, by contrast, gave him elegance, a cape, and an accent that still echoes in every parody. In the 1950s and 60s, Christopher Lee made him both terrifying and magnetic, a figure of dark sexuality. Later, Francis Ford Coppola's 1992 film painted him as tragic as well as monstrous. Each generation remade Dracula, but each clung to the same name. Meanwhile, the historical Vlad was being rediscovered. In the 19th century, during the rise of nationalism in Eastern Europe, Romanian intellectuals searched for heroes who had defended their land against invaders. Vlad, once demonized in German pamphlets, was reinterpreted as a patriot who had resisted Ottoman domination at any cost. His cruelty, they argued, was the harsh justice of a land on the frontier of empires. Writers celebrated him as a restorer of order, a ruler who punished corruption and lawlessness. In the 20th century, even under communism, he was sometimes praised as a symbol of strength against foreign powers. Thus, two Draculas lived side by side. In the West, he was the vampire count, stalking night and imagination. In Romania, he was a national hero, defended as a prince who had fought for independence. The same name carried both horror and pride, nightmare and patriotism. The irony was stark. Vlad's reigns had been short, his victories precarious, his defeats many. He had sought survival through fear, but his power crumbled again and again. And yet, his name outlived all his rivals, even the conquerors who had humbled him. Mehmed II died in 1481, his empire enduring, but his name less vivid in Western memory. Matthias Corvinus of Hungary, who had once imprisoned Vlad, is remembered mainly by historians. But Dracula, a fusion of fact and fiction, became immortal. Tourism today bears witness to that immortality. Bran Castle in Transylvania, though never Vlad's seat, is marketed as Dracula's castle, drawing visitors from across the world. Guides tell stories of the Impaler's cruelty, and the vampire count's imagined haunts in the same breath. Souvenirs mix Stoker's fiction with medieval history until the two are indistinguishable. Vlad himself would likely have sneered, but he might also have understood. Terror, spectacle, and rumor had always been his chosen tools. Modern culture has taken Dracula far beyond his origins. He has appeared in hundreds of films, cartoons, and novels. He has been a villain, an anti-hero, even a comic figure. He has fought werewolves, hunted Van Helsing, and lived on in children's shows. Each incarnation erases the man a little more, but keeps the name alive. It is immortality of a kind, the kind no other prince of the 15th century achieved. What then is his legacy? In Romania, he remains contested. Some see him as a tyrant, a cruel despot whose punishment scarred the land. Others hail him as a national hero, a symbol of resistance, a man who dared to defy the greatest conqueror of his age. Abroad, he survives less as history than as myth. The vampire, the count, the immortal creature of the night. The paradox is complete. Vlad's reigns failed. His people betrayed him. His allies abandoned him. He died violently, his head on a stake in Constantinople. By the measures of power, he lost, but by the measures of memory, he triumphed. He sought to rule through fear, and fear carried his name farther than armies ever could. From 15th century pamphlets to 21st century films, from German woodcuts to Bram Stoker's pages, from Transylvanian castles to Hollywood sound stages, his journey is astonishing. Vlad Dracula, the Impaler, Prince of Wallachia, has become Count Dracula, Lord of the Undead. The man is long gone. The legend walks forever.